Okay, wonderful. So yes, as part of my PhD, I was working on tracking lake quaternary source-to-sink sediment transfer and composition in the Gulf of Papua. So as you probably know, the Gulf of Papua is a young, tectonically active landscape, and it has a very large terrigenous sediment crust. And in order to assess potential reservoir quality in the sediments deposited in the Gulf, it is first essential to understand their mineralogical composition, which means tracing them back from the Gulf to their source. To do this over long time scales, we first need to know the erodibility of the various lithologies around the Gulf. And so I had to constrain erodibility coefficients for specific lithologies in the Gulf catchment using present-day conditions. And I then used those coefficients in a calibrated landscape evolution model, and I used that to track rock types from source to sink. So I used Badlands for this, and Badlands by default uses the screen power law to simulate drizzle incisions. And for the lake quaternary, most of these variables are either known or can be estimated because we're looking at a very young landscape. We can usually just use modern data. So we have a good handle on precipitation rates, uplift rates, the distribution of lithology, and on the sediment flux because we have measurements of the sediment loads of the major rivers in the area. The unknown variable is the erodibility, and so we can use those known variables to constrain the erodibility. My objectives were first to constrain lithology-specific erodibility coefficients for the Gulf of Papua, and then to track rock types from source to sink using Badlands. So major control on the erodibility of the rock is its lithology. So I created 5 umbrella categories for terrigenous rocks that should have similar erodibilities. And those are on the right there, but the blue is just the marine environment of the present day. I just gave the same erodibility coefficient as the soft sediment category. So to constrain the erodibility coefficients for the different lithologies, I iteratively ran a series of simulations varying the erodibility coefficients of those categories, and each simulation represented the surface evolution of the Gulf over the past 35,000 years. And I would then compare the measured sediment loads of the Fly, Picori, and Ferrari rivers, and those were on the right. On the left. I compared those measurements to the sediment loads of the equivalent rivers in my simulation. And so on the right is my simulation that best accounts for the measured sediment loads. And these are the erodibility coefficients that I use in that simulation. The soft sediment has the highest erodibility coefficient, and carbonates, granites, and metamorphics have the lowest. These are my results, essentially. An animation of my best simulation. And I was able to simulate the landscape evolution of the Gulf, tracking rock types from source to sink. And in the model, you can see how rivers and epicenters evolve through space and time. So we're able to observe how patterns of marine deposition are influenced by bathymetry, changes in sea level, and the upland distribution of surface lithologies. So, for example, in the Western Gulf, the Fly River drains the central Papuan origin and transports sediments that derive from mafics, metamorphics, and soft sediment into the Western Gulf. At low stand, the Fly delivers the sediment into this epicenter in the south, which is spatially and compositionally distinct from a central epicenter here. The sediment that ends up in the central epicenter is derived from the small catchments draining the southern Papuan origin, and those don't contain metamorphics and granites. So at low stand, the rivers feed mafics and soft sediments directly onto the slope in the Western Gulf. Yeah, in the Western Gulf, sorry. As sea level rises, you have more sediment being deposited on the shelf in the west. But there's also a mixing of the sediment sources. so that by the time sediment reaches the deep sea depth centres down here, they are no longer compositionally distinct. You have a mix of metamorphic, mafic, and soft sediment-derived sediments in each of them. So sedimentation patterns and composition in the Western Gulf are strongly influenced by both the upslope distribution of surface lithologies and the glaciostatic cycle, with partitioning of continental slope depositions at low stand, but mixing of river sources during marine transpiration. So in conclusion, using Badlands, I was able to constrain lithology-specific erodibility coefficients using the sediment loads of the major rivers, and I then used Badlands to track rock types from source to source. Thank you. And are there any questions?